In this essay, I will be exploring the film focus of film movements, specifically the French and Hong Kong New Wave through Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless and Wong Kar-wai's Chungking Express. I chose to analyze these films as they are both quintessential in their own respective movements and are highly reflective of their respective urban geographies. Breathless follows Michel, a small-time thug in Paris, as he evades the authorities by living with his American lover after he kills a policeman. Chungking Express loosely follows the lives of 4 young individuals and their relationships in Hong Kong within a certain period of time. Within the urban realism of these films, both put a distinct focus on a few characters to intimately explore the nature of contemporary human relationships in their bustling urban settings. This leads me to establish the inquiry question: to what extent do Paris and Hong Kong affect the interpersonal relationships of their residents in Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless and Wong Kar-wai's Chungking Express? I will analyze this question by connecting filmic elements to the geographic and historical context of each city. The film Breathless was a part of the French New Wave movement, which emerged as a movement against narrative-heavy traditional French cinema of the time. The movement had many young filmmakers who were inspired by auteurs in Hollywood, their urban setting in Paris, and their position as youth in post-war France.
La jeunesse qu'il faut essayer, c'est que ça soit plutôt la jeunesse qui influence le cinéma, c'est-à-dire de rester.
Thus, the youthful spirit translates on screen to the fresh, playful nature of French New Wave films through inconsistent editing, handheld camera movements, and unfocused, evolving plots. Jean-Luc Godard specifically created Breathless as a reactionary film against the conventional French cinema and audiences at the time. Breathless is one of the most cited examples of the French New Wave and sets some of the most well-known conventions of the film movement. Thus, it fits within its movement quite well. Chungking Express comes from the second Hong Kong New Wave, which similarly emerged from young filmmakers educated in Western cinematic conventions. This movement inspired a move towards more diverse film styles, techniques, and narratives beyond traditional Hong Kong cinema. Chungking Express came out in 1994 when there were many political tensions as the UK and China bargained over the future status of Hong Kong preceding its handover to China. Hong Kong's unique status as a major semi-autonomous economic hub with a large and diverse population gave it a special importance as it tussled between the Chinese and British spheres of influence. Although the Hong Kong New Wave does not have set filmic conventions that define it, Chungking Express still stands out as a unique film within the New Wave cinematic canon, due to its lesser focus on crime and action. Both movements have a heavy focus on their geographical location, which is prominently featured throughout their films and informs the type of characters that are depicted. Breathless mostly features handheld shots with constant movement, which visually create the feeling of instability and breathlessness. In addition, the shot sizes often range from extreme wide shots in an effort to convey the urban setting to extreme close-ups that bring the audience's focus to the main characters. Author Kristen Ross explains how France transformed almost breathlessly from a rural, empire-oriented Catholic country into a fully industrialized, decolonized urban one. This rapid industrialization, which was especially apparent in Paris, is reflected in the hurried conversations in the film, where Michel is usually performing another task while talking and often only holds conversations as a means to an end. An occasional exception to this phenomenon are the conversations between Michel and Patricia, though this later proves to be a weakness for Michel as he delays his escape from France due to his love for Patricia. Therefore, the rushed urban setting of Paris is shown to be inhospitable to their unhurried relationship. Chungking Express 2 had been filmed after Hong Kong had already become a fast-paced, industrialized city. However, the cinematography in this film chooses to emphasize on the slower, contemplative moments of the characters amidst the bustle of the city, shown through a variation in the frames per second of the footage. The relationships resemble the cinematography, with the constant feeling of longing and loneliness in each character contrasting the faster pace of the city. The mise-en-scène in this film also often frames the characters between urban walls or surfaces, which create a crowding and isolating feeling that illustrate the loneliness of the characters perpetuated by their urban surroundings. The urban rush of both Hong Kong and Paris also affected the filmmaking processes. Both films were shot in about 23 days, with the directors writing the scripts for the films during the filming process. The fluid scripts of both films promoted improvisational dialogues and loose narratives in both films, with more focus on visual style. In addition to being influenced by the local geography, both films also reflect the changing globalized landscapes of their respective cities. Along with most of Europe, post-war France was inundated with American influence and consumer culture. History professor Richard Quizal states that the issue for the French was to find a way to possess American prosperity and economic power, and yet to avoid what appeared to be the accompanying social and cultural costs. This complex was further observable in traditional French cinema, which emphasized French identity through numerous French literature to screen adaptations. Breathless explores this conflict between nationalism and Americanization through the characterization of Michel, who was equally influenced by American film star Humphrey Bogart in his style and heavy-handed in French patriotism. This dilemma is further illustrated through his unstable relationship with his American lover Patricia, whom he frequently admonishes for her spoken French. The creation and filmmaking conventions of the film itself encounters a similar French and American dilemma, which critic Dennis Turner describes stating, "The oscillation in Breathless, from attempts to identify itself with Hollywood cinema to a recognition of the imaginary nature of that pursuit, is apparent from the very first frames of the film." Similarly, Chungking Express, named after the diverse Chungking Mansions neighborhood and the Midnight Express store in the film, reflects the evolving global identity and multiculturality of Hong Kong through sound editing and dialogue. The beginning sequences feature classical Indian and film music, representative of the majority South Asian population of the Chungking Mansions neighborhood. In the second story, Faye continuously listens to the pop song California Dreaming, sung by an American band. Additionally, Cop 223 in the first story speaks 4 languages in an effort to communicate with a woman in the blonde wig. Despite the multiculturality of Hong Kong augmenting the cultural and linguistic understandings of its residents, the characters are still unable to communicate with each other on an emotional level, making it impossible for them to achieve true understanding of one another. Miscommunication is also central in most of the conversations between Michel and Patricia. Film author Laura Gentile states that in the dialogues Michel has with Patricia, which seem rather like misread and reactive monologues, he cannot keep up the conversation when confronted with her knowledgeability. They talk to each other, but they do not respond to each other, which is a mutual flaw. Breathless leans more towards a pessimistic depiction of the lack of communication, which is ultimately fatal for Michel. In contrast, Chungking Express acknowledges the lack of communication between its characters, but is still ultimately hopelessly romantic in its message. Even though it is impossible for any of the characters to end up together due to their various situations, they still convey the sincerity and love they could not express in words through external means. The woman in the blonde wig indirectly sends Cop 223 a birthday message through a phone service, while Faye gives Cop 663 a hand-drawn boarding pass dated for a year later, a date for when she would visit him again. This purposeful lack of emotional and descriptive dialogue between the characters compelled the audience to search for meaning visually and creates a quiet, passionate intensity in the characters' relationships that contrast their loud urban settings, a signature of Wong Kar-wai's films. In addition to the general cultural context of each city, Breathless and Chungking Express were also influenced by the cinema culture of their times and the cinematic conventions that the directors adopted from them. Jean-Luc Godard was part of the Cahiers du Cinéma filmmakers group, who were critical of the tradition of quality French cinema and highly influenced by Italian neorealism and classic Hollywood authors such as Alfred Hitchcock. The influence of these film movements on Breathless is illustrated through its filmmaking practices and mise-en-scène. Breathless, similar to Italian neorealism, was shot on a low budget with accessible natural locations and natural lighting, which allowed it to be more realistic and accessible to younger audiences in France. Realism also affects the narrative of Breathless, which chooses to portray a more realistic, nuanced relationship between its two main characters. Therefore, the cinephile culture that existed in Paris in the 1950s via cineclubs and cinema magazines diversified the type of film narratives that were available to French filmmakers and influenced their writing style to include more unconventional relationships, such as the one in Breathless. Chungking Express, too, has a variety of Western literary and cinematic influences. Wong Kar-wai's family moved from Shanghai to Hong Kong in 1963 as a result of the Cultural Revolution in China. This relocation allowed him to be exposed to a variety of foreign films, including French New Wave films, something that would not have been possible in mainland China due to foreign film censorship. These Western influences are visible in Wong Kar-wai's filmmaking style, with some direct influences from Jean-Luc Godard himself, characterized through his usage of young, conflicted characters and unconventional editing techniques, such as jump cuts, which lends a similar sense of chaos and confusion to the relationships in both Breathless and Chungking Express. In conclusion, the geographic context of Paris and Hong Kong affect the depiction of relationships between the characters in Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless and Wong Kar-wai's Chungking Express to a strong degree, through the industrialization, globalization, and cinema culture of each city. Breathless particularly shows how the capitalist urban nature of Paris encourages transactionality in relationships, how the dilemma between two cultures creates instability in relationships, all of which is depicted with nuance and realism due to the effect of cinema culture in Paris at the time. Chungking Express similarly depicts the loneliness of his characters stemming from the urban mass of Hong Kong through a more intimate and slow lens that contrasts the pace of the city, but also imparts a more romantic message of human connection as compared to the cynicism of Breathless. Both films prove an undeniable connection between rich urban geographies and new forms of human relationships that have emerged out of the modernization of this world.